The following is a presentation given by Mel Wiseman-Lee with Jonathan Gadsby on the 9th of September 2015 at the Critical Mental Health Nurses Network's second event held at Birmingham City University. The presentation is called Escaping Psi Dominance Ideas from Critical and Community Psychology. The aim of the presentation was to introduce the network to some of the ideas and voices from the critical and community psychology community in the United Kingdom. We wanted to introduce the argument that instead of being quite different, both psychology and psychiatry have the same aim. We began with this quote from Michel Foucault. In many ways, this quotation is an excellent summary of the way in which the network understands the word critical. Another important quote, this time from Bauman 2007. In many ways, this quotation is an excellent starting place for our presentation, and our argument is that the disciplines of psychiatry and psychology are two of the mechanisms by which this is achieved. The phrase psi dominance was a creation of Mel's, specially for the presentation. It is the individualizing and internalizing of avoidable human distress which obscures the importance of social context, sources of oppression, inequality, abuse, and other barriers to liberation, connection, and human flourishing. Much of the rest of this presentation concerns this notion of individualizing and internalizing. As a ward nurse and later a community nurse, I had a view that psychology was in some ways the antidote to psychiatry. Psychiatry seemed to close down explanation with its focus on biology and sedating tablets. On the other hand, psychology seemed to open up explanations, provide talking, therapy, and the possibility of personal change and making sense of one's experiences. However, in 2013, in the book Madness Contested, Power and Practice, edited by Coles, Diamond and Keenan, Stephen Coles argues that psychiatry and psychology are a difficult spot the difference. This slide summarizes some of his reasons. We can see that both psychiatry and psychology require an expert to assess and treat distress, using technical language, making the individual the focus of the problem and the place in which solutions may be found, and also makes the social context very much secondary to the individual, to the extent that the social context may even become very difficult to see or invisible. In this key slide, we describe some of the impact of this psi dominance. Individualizing, pathologizing, increasing social marginalization, a sense of not being a proper person, and somebody who needs experts and drugs to fix or manage them. The word iatrogenic, meaning brought forth by the healer, is a very challenging word for us, nurses, doctors, and others involved in healthcare. The word iatrogenic brings into question some of our best intentions as healthcare professionals. Even seemingly uncontroversial ideas such as being person-centered are brought into a new focus through the lens of psi dominance. In fact, for all of psychology's pretensions at being scientific, its knowledge base is as contestable as psychiatry's. One could say that whilst both have the appearance of standing on firm ground, really both are supported more by power structures than by evidence. It was important to us to not merely critique psychiatry and psychology, but to bring people to the kinds of focus and the kinds of action that clinicians who hold such views become interested in. This list introduces this second half of our presentation. One can see that all of these are an effort to reverse the individualization of distress. At the end of this slide is the question, is it enough to escape? Many psychologists are concluding at the moment that it isn't enough. Psychologists get political. Here are some examples of recent happenings within the world of psychology which are much more overtly political than has been the case in the past. In this presentation, we particularly wanted to introduce 3 documents. The first 2 are the British Psychological Society's position statement on diagnosis, and also their language guidance document. Both of those were published in 2013. 2 years later, they published the Understanding Psychosis document. More on those 3 in a minute. Also notable on this list, Psychologists Against Austerity, perhaps the most overtly political expression of current thinking in psychology in the UK. Set up at the end of 2014 for the run-up to the 2015 election, it hoped to raise awareness of the link between austerity economics and mental health. After the win for the Conservative Party, Psychologists Against Austerity decided to continue. We will shortly see a quote from the British Psychological Society's position statement. This snapshot of a website showed some of the reaction to it in the mainstream press. It was very much meant to be, and was certainly seen as, a moment in which a whole profession put the gloves on against another profession within mental health. The timing of it was to be coinciding with the release of the DSM-5 around April 2013. One of the other documents, Understanding Psychosis and Schizophrenia, is a free download, and the link is provided in the notes that accompany this presentation. It's an excellent document that has had some criticisms, mostly concerns about whether it adequately represents the views and perspectives of cultural minorities. However, it is written very carefully in plain English and wonderfully illustrates how one might conceive of acute distress in less pathologizing, less individualizing ways. It will be of great interest to nurses with a critical outlook, and we thoroughly recommend reading it. That it was produced by such a mainstream body is evidence that these critical ideas have migrated very much from the wacky fringe to a very central position in the world of psychology in recent years. Here is the website for Psychologists Against Austerity. Well worth a look, and they continue to organise events. This is a news report of a very recent walk of 100 miles by a group of psychologists wanting to draw attention to the impact of austerity economics on mental health. They visited food banks, they slept rough along the way. We wanted to share this new textbook. It's a significant departure from the language of previous psychology textbooks which focused on abnormality towards an understanding which reflects a more critical outlook, a more skeptical outlook, and one which seeks to try to avoid the individualization of distress in society. It's also written in a very clear and plain way, and we think it will be of great interest to nurses with a critical outlook. Here is a quote from that position statement, the DCP being the Division of Clinical Psychology, part of the British Psychological Society. As I said, timed to coincide with the release of the DSM-5. The DCP is of the view that it is timely and appropriate to affirm publicly that the current classification system as outlined in DSM and ICD in respect of the functional psychiatric diagnoses has significant conceptual and empirical limitations. Consequently, there is a need for a paradigm shift in relation to the experiences that these diagnoses refer to towards a conceptual system not based on a disease model. Very strong words. We made some paper copies of the British Psychological Society's language guidelines. This document, using the principles outlined here, tries to encourage the replacing of language which pathologizes, illness-laden language, with less pathologizing, more politically neutral words. We discussed as a group what it would be like to adopt these words. Some felt that it would make a person into a very controversial and confrontational person within a team, and it was recognized that this may contain extra difficulties for student nurses. However, my experience, which I explained, was that using these words had instead made it seem that I was being more precise about the experiences of service users, and in fact largely my dropping of illness-laden language had gone unnoticed. Certainly different people will have different experiences with this, and two of the members in the room decided that they would like to try for themselves to use this language over the course of the coming month and then write a report about their experiences with it. We very much hope to be able to report more and give more reaction to this document through the network in the coming months. You're very welcome to email any questions you would like to about this presentation to Mel Wiseman-Lee. She is a clinical psychologist working within the NHS and has recently written a master's module on this subject. You can of course also email using the Contact Us section of the Critical Mental Health Nurses Network website. A final couple of slides. This one, some of the important names in critical psychology in the UK right now, some of which will be known perhaps, and many have appeared in one way or another throughout the presentation so far. There was a quote by Mary Boyle, who can be found on YouTube, and also wrote a chapter in the book Madness Contested, Power and Practice, mentioned earlier. A very insightful and critical writer. David Pilgrim's work will be of great interest, and perhaps particularly those who went to Gary Sidley's presentation on the Mental Health Act will find his work also very interesting. We mentioned the Midland Psychology Group, David Smale, the British Psychological Society's annual large national conference is going to look at the work of David Smale, who died earlier this year. That they should be choosing David Smale is an indication that this mainstream clinical psychology group is willing to consider some very radical ideas, because there are few more radical than David Smale. John Crombie, one of the authors of the textbook that was mentioned, as was David Harper on this list. Rufus May, known to many in his leading role in the Hearing Voices movement. David Harper, also the textbook. Lucy Johnson, a very clear and excellent writer on the subject, particularly of diagnosis, and has a recent book published by PCCS, short book, which is a triumph of plain English on the subject. Lynn Friedley has been mentioned earlier in this presentation, but also recently in the news with some extremely well-conceived criticism of the government's plans to use psychologists in job centres, which she claims is seeking to frame unemployment as a personal psychological failing and is therefore using psychology to oppress people. Anne Cook, who wrote the Understanding Psychosis and Schizophrenia document that's been mentioned, there are other names there too. We wrote this slide in anticipation of a question about CBT, and those who are particularly interested in how this presentation might view CBT might like to pause here and look at this further. And here are a few of the references from today's presentation.